This tutorial is part of our Django Database ORM Mastery course, where we learn how to master building and interacting with databases within a Django project. You can watch the entire course uninterrupted, ad-free, and access updated tutorial source code and other course resources from our Udemy course. Alternatively, you can access the course YouTube playlist featuring tutorials from this course. Links to our Udemy course and YouTube playlist can be found in the video description. This tutorial is not intended to dive deeply into the subject matter. We hope to introduce and take the first steps, priming you with underpinning knowledge to give you the starting point to explore the Django QuerySet further. In this tutorial, we're going to try and outline the purpose and role of the QuerySet. A quick recap. So far, we know that we start by building Django models as a class. A model class represents a database table. To return data from the database, for example, we require the QuerySet API methods, which can be accessed via the model manager. So before we delve into QuerySets, let's ensure that we have a basic understanding of a query in the context of relational databases. Let's think of a query as a means to communicate with the database backend. We send queries to the database backend, which reads the query and performs the action. Writing a query requires a query language known to the database so that it can actually understand the instruction. The standard query language for database management is Structured Query Language, SQL. Other query languages do exist, but in general, and in the world of Django and relational databases, SQL will be used. Now, as I mentioned, the Django ORM provides developers with a non-SQL approach in that we can write database actions or queries in Python, not SQL. Although this is true for the developer, importantly, behind the scenes, abstracted away from view, Django will be converting our Python code into SQL before then sending the query to the database so it can be read and then actioned by the database. So this image depicts the fact that we utilize the model manager to access the QuerySet API. We generate our equivalent queries in our Django environment, and then this will then get converted into an actual SQL statement, which can then be executed by the database and then return the data. For example, if we have requested any data from the database, return that back to our Django application. So we now have a query, or we know about a query, which is a way of us actually sending information to the database so it can then perform the action. So let's talk a little bit about the QuerySet API. Now remember what's happening here loosely. We are utilizing the tools in the QuerySet API to construct a way of then creating an SQL statement, which will then be executed by the database to perform the action that we need within our application. So the QuerySet API allows the Django developer to write database queries without learning SQL to interact with the database. It provides a range of different methods to create, return, update, and delete data, and other refinements to create specific query operations or actions for our database to execute. If you type in Django QuerySet API into Google, typically the top option will be the Django documentation detailing the QuerySet API. So what you're going to find here in the documentation is a list here of all the methods here on the right-hand side. So these are all the methods here that we can utilize to generate or create queries or instructions for the database to perform. So there's a number of different instructions here, as well as different refinements that we can utilize to really fine-tune our query to return specific data from the database. So we saw an example, or I've been providing an example, utilizing the all method here. So let's take a look at that in action. So let's put the QuerySet API into action. Here we have a simple Django model. Don't worry, we're not following along step by step here. Just going to show you this example. So here we have a model here. This is a student table with just one field, which is first name. I've gone ahead and populated this so I can access this table, just show the table. So we have, it looks like 5 different names here, first names or 5 different students actually in our database. So this is our actual database here. It has 2 fields. and you can see the first names that we've entered into our database. So I've entered the Python shell here. I'm going to, first of all, import the resources. That's the student table. And then I'm going to run a query to return all of the data from the database. So remember, what we're going to need here is the name of the model, which is student. And then remember, we're going to need our manager, which is objects. So notice there isn't any reference here actually in our model here to the objects model manager. This is assigned to each and every model. So we know that behind the scenes it's available. So I need my model manager here, objects, and then I can use one of the methods from the QuerySet API. So if we just bring that documentation back in here. So here we've been showing the example previously in this mini series of the all method here, which should then return all the data, all the fields and all the data from the model that we specified. So let's give that a go. So that's the method that we're using here. Now press enter and you can see here that in actual fact, we're returning all the data from our database. So far we have created a query without utilizing any SQL. And like I mentioned previously, behind the scenes, Django is converting our code that we generated to actually generate the data from the database into SQL. So let's take a look at it. Behind the scenes, Django is keeping a record of the SQL queries that were executed by the database, as we had previously created a so-called query to return data from the student table. We can now access that data. So here I'm going to bring in the connection resource, and then that's going to then give us access to the connection query so we can view the query that was generated by the action that we performed previously. So if I were to print the connection queries, we can now see the query equivalent that was generated from the action that we took previously. So you may remember we typed in student.objects.all to actually return all the data from the student table. So this is the SQL equivalent that is generated and then passed over to a database to execute our instructions. So a common operation that you're going to perform on your data is that you're going to filter out data. So you're going to make refinements on your query. So let's, for example, we wanted to return all the students where the first name was equal to something. So what we have here is the filter function. So we can utilize this to, as it says here, returns a new query set containing objects that match the given lookup parameters. So let's go back to the code here. So we know that this here will return all the data. So now we can add in a filter. So we don't need to specify all here. So we're just going to look at all the data. So we're going to create a filter. So we're going to say here that, for example, first name is equal to, and let's just specify a first name here. So let's give that a go. And notice now, instead of returning all the data from the database, we specified data utilizing the filter function here and returned all the students where the first name equals ELI. So again, we can inspect that query. So let's print the queries, and here we go. So it looks like we've selected the ID field and the first name field from the test app student database. That was the first query. So we can now look at the second query here. So the same thing again, we selected the same fields from the same table, but this time there is a where clause. So where the student first name equals and then the string ELI. So hopefully that has given you a visualization, an idea of what's happening here. We utilize the Django QuerySet API to create queries, and you can see how that enables us to fine-tune the query to generate instructions that we're going to need to return specific data from the database. Now you can already see from the length of this SQL statement how lengthy that can be in comparison to what we actually have to type here in Django. So for example here, this student objects filter first name equals Ellie, that's equivalent to, for example, remember for example, all of this code here. So you can see it's a lot quicker and a lot easier to create queries than potentially writing SQL code. Hopefully that example has given you a better understanding now of the knowledge that we learned previously and about queries and the QuerySet API. So hopefully now we have all the underpinning knowledge to better understand the query set. If we take a look at the QuerySet API reference here, they separate the methods into really two categories. The first category are methods that return new query sets and methods that do not return query sets. So here we're referencing the fact that when we return data from the database, it's in a particular format so that we can work with it within our Django project. So here, the methods here that return query sets are methods that actually extract data from the database or perform some sort of interaction with the database and returns data from the database. Whereas the methods that do not return query sets, apart from get, for example, everything here potentially performs an action on the database that doesn't necessarily return any data from the database. So take example here, create. So here we're creating data in the database. So we're not returning any data. We're counting data. For example, we're updating data. So those type of operations that we might want to perform where we're not necessarily returning any data from the database. So generally, we now have learned that there are two types of methods provided by the QuerySet API. Those that return query sets and those that don't. When a query set is evaluated that returns data from a database, a query set is returned. Each row returned from the database is represented as an object inside a query set. The query set is generally defined as a collection of objects from the database. So a query set is just a type, like any other Python type. If we inspect a query set, we find a query set type. So I've said quite a lot there. Now let me just put that into context here. So here we have a query set which is going to return all of the students with the first name Ellie. But let's just go for the all. So we'll just return all the data from our database. So if we execute that, it's returning all the data. Now notice what gets returned here are objects inside of a query set. Now this query set is iterable, so we can iterate over it with the general and built-in Python tools, like we would do iterating over any list, for example, and we can extract this data from the query set. If we're not too sure, we can utilize, for example, type to inspect the type of data. So let's say x equals, let's just run this query again, student.objects.all. So we return that into our variable here, and let's just go ahead and print and then type. So we can inspect the type of the returned object here. And you can see here that we return a query set. So the type of data that's being returned here, is a query set. And we can see that the objects here represent the individual rows inside of in this case, the student table. So we can visualize this in our diagram. Here we have a query set returned. Then each row inside of a student table, assuming that we've queried this table and returned all the data, each row here will be returned as an object inside of our query set. And of course, then we can go into the query set utilizing our Python language and extract the data from it. So we can loosely now say that a query set is constructed via the model manager, is created utilizing the QuerySet API methods that return a query set. So although this diagram isn't technically correct, we can now see the bigger picture here, the general flow utilizing the Django ORM. We are going to be creating a model. That model creates tables. Once we have tables, we can insert data. Once we have data, we can then generate queries utilizing the QuerySet API. So we've seen an example of utilizing the all filter, the all function. Behind the scenes, that's going to get converted into an SQL statement, which can then be executed on the database, and data can then be returned through the ORM, and a query set can be generated. And inside of our query set, each row that's returned from the database will then be converted into an object inside of that query set. So our aim in this tutorial was to try and outline the purpose and role of a query set. So hopefully you've got a better understanding now of not only the query set, but how we interact with the Django QuerySet API to generate queries to return the query set. So to try and summarize, the Django ORM provides a convenient way of extracting data from the database. To return data from the database, we construct a query set through the model manager. Data is returned in a query set. A query set represents a collection of objects from the database. each record or row returned from the database will be represented as an object within the query set.